You can trust the experts, but don't idealize people. Don't idealize doctors and idealize, people in authority, because that can be a reenactment of childhood trauma. When we actually look at, okay, what does this person know that they can share with me that I don't know? What can I take with a grain of salt? What can I apply because it makes sense to me? When I'm in the driver's seat, right? I'm not so heavily reliant on these authority figures.
Welcome to Entrepreneurs Recovery Podcast, where we explore the world of entrepreneurship, resilience, recovery, and the healing potential of psychedelics. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. If you resonate with today's episode, I'd love for you to go and maybe subscribe on YouTube or leave a review on Spotify or Amazon. Amazon's fine too, Spotify and iTunes. And that helps people to reach this show. And as we approach 300 subscribers on YouTube, thank you so much for the growth of this show, this podcast. And it really helps guests too, new guests to have on the show to find this program, this podcast. So thank you so much for supporting this show. And what I want to share today is we are on episode number 4 of Dr. Keean Kirk coming back to the show. Today's episode, I'm really excited about because this is something I've personally had a lifelong journey experiencing. We get deeply into this idea of idealization and devaluation. We also get into emotional fusing, and we get into a few other things about some of the things we're facing in society post-COVID, and just a lot of topics that I hope you resonate with in this about hour-long episode. Also, we had a special announcement that we are going to be launching, me and Dr. Keean are going to be launching a 4 to 6 week long experience. And we're going to talk about how long it's going to be, but it's going to be Zoom calls. It's going to be a community to share, a safe community to share about these topics of Dr. Keean's research and research on the brain and my research on the heart and the heart-brain experiences and training that I've went through. So stay tuned for that. We will talk about it. You also get to see my allergies throughout the episode, which is really fun. And then Dr. Keean was actually passing a kidney stone and was in a lot of pain. So we really showed our resilience during this episode. I hope you enjoy. Hey, Dr. Keean, welcome back to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. This is episode 4. This is the 4th time we've had you back. And there's a reason for that, because there's a lot to cover in the world of, let's say, psychotherapy, holistic healing, and also just being an entrepreneur in recovery, and even just being a human in recovery. And hopefully people understand when I say recovery that maybe I am speaking to you in AA, but it's not just about recovery from drugs and alcohol here. We're talking about recovery from, emotional addictions and emotional ways of being, maybe trauma and things that have happened. But also just I think being human, the human experience.
Exactly.
The process of unlearning and deprogramming things that no longer serve us, but are still operating every day in our nervous system. And that's why we bring you back on. We do this series. And at the end of this episode, we're going to have a special announcement too. So I'm excited to get into this episode, to dive in deep, to continue on, and to dive into topics that not only am I interested in, you're, I would say, an expert in, it's also people who are listening to the show and what they want to hear and what we can cover in this 60-minute episode. So I'm excited to dive back in once again.
Yes, absolutely. I love that we're continuing the dialogue. And like you said, there's just so much to go over, but it's great information. And the whole point of it is to just empower the listeners, right? So that they can apply these concepts, wrap their mind around these concepts, and then start the healing process.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I wanted to start off with, which is something that we've talked about for many, many moons, many hours, and it's this ideal idea of idealization and devaluation. And
Hmm.
I'd like to start there because this is something that is near to my heart, because it's something that I developed really early on, was idealizing the people around me as a way of almost like an emotional protective mechanism. And it was almost like a high in itself, by idealizing my mother, or idealizing God, or idealizing authority figures, because I really didn't feel safe in my own body, my own way of being. And maybe you can start off with explaining what idealization is, and then we can get into, of course, the opposite. But maybe we'll start with, what is idealization? We'll give some examples and dive into it.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're kind of just starting with what is idealization, it is basically a defense mechanism that happens when our nervous system is seeking safety through certainty, right? Like we have to know the answer, we have to have clarity. It's common in people who grew up in environments with caregivers that were emotionally dysregulated, parents, that were not emotionally stable. And they grew up in these environments of emotional unpredictability, neglect, or relational trauma. And so, if we're looking at what idealization is neurobiologically, it's driven by this overactive amygdala, right? And we know that that's the threat detector in the brain. But it's not just that part, it's also paired with the underregulated prefrontal cortex, which again is like, this is the part of the brain where, we have executive functioning and logic. And the brain says, if I can just make you perfect, I'll be safe with you, right? And so idealization creates like this false sense of security and safety by often elevating someone to a pedestal, often unconsciously, suppressing or pushing away any red flags, ambiguity, or feelings of discomfort. And that is not based in love or connection. It's actually rooted in survival. And so we see this a lot when, people that will be idealizing someone, they will put them on the pedestal, and then, they can do no wrong. It's kind of like, if you've ever been on a date and, you're having a picnic with somebody and you're just starting to get to know them and you love the time you're spending with them and you're feeling connected and you're kind of in this like honeymoon phase, right? And you are essentially, they could do no wrong, right? If they did something small, it would not set you off because, again, you're really making them perfect in your mind, right? I'll be safe with you if I'm perfect. So this is driven by, emotional dysregulation, and it's driven by the need to be regulated, right? So the person who is idealizing, which some of us, can idealize without having, certain personality disorders or certain diagnoses, that we can idealize and we can also devalue, but we are not, it is not a requirement that if somebody is idealizing or devaluing, that they, for example, have, borderline personality disorder or a personality disorder. This can also be a trauma response from being raised in environments by parents or caregivers with either personality disorders or chronic dysregulation. And so the brain has to basically track, right, where the parent is at all times. And this is where we abandon our own sense of self, our own authenticity, our own emotions, because our relationship with our emotions is not super important. What's important is we know how to track their emotions. We know how to follow their emotions. And so if the parent or the caregiver was oscillating between idealizing the child and then devaluing them, which we'll get into next, is, that's a situation where our brain would be hardwired to do that with the world, right? We would grow up as that child, and then navigate the world in order to, again, regulate our nervous system, find a false sense of security by elevating someone onto a pedestal and really just kind of suppressing any of the red flags like we discussed. And again, this is based in survival. And so you can see a child that's gone through certain types of relational trauma. They will do this as a defense mechanism and they have no idea they're doing it, but they're going out into the world and they're saying, this person's unsafe, this person's safe. This person's unsafe, this person's safe, right? And their brain is just kind of tracking it. And so if we look at idealization, it is driven by that emotional dysregulation. We're trying to regulate ourselves and find the safety from the overactive amygdala.
Yeah, and I think some of the common examples that I've seen in my own life and in others, but I'll speak for myself, is idealizing, of course, romantic partners, but idealizing a coach, idealizing a mentor, idealizing people who are heads of organizations that maybe you want to be a part of, or even idealizing religious figures. So you end up seeing these people as perfect or flawless. And the reality is they're not, especially as you get closer to them, which I eventually did, especially as an entrepreneur. I used to idealize certain mentors, especially before I left my 9-to-5 job. I would absolutely idealize certain people. And then once I got closer to them, of course, I would see they're not flawless. But the thing is it was a real problem. Idealizing them put them in the flawless state where I would feel almost inferior in so many ways to what they could do, even though in many other areas of my life, I was doing things much more in alignment with what I thought was important, like health and different things. But when it came to the thing they were teaching, the guru in that area, I was idealizing them, putting them in this unrealistic place, unrealistic expectations. And I think we can do that with coaches, mentors. And obviously I'm speaking to many entrepreneurs, right? We have coaches or mentors, or like I said, it could be religious figures. It could even be psychedelics, idealizing psychedelics, what they can do, putting these things on a pedestal as the magic bullet. And I think people get in traps with that stuff, oh, this Western model's broken, psychedelics is the answer. So we're now idealizing, even though there's so many nuances to psychedelics, they're not flawless, they're not perfect. And so I think this idea of idealizing even healing retreats, idealizing, even cryptocurrency. Look at people right now at crypto. It's like, if I put some money in, I'm going to be free. I'm going to win back the respect of my family, or I'm going to be able to buy that house. So idealizing instead of seeing it for what it is, that the market is going to slap you in the face. There's things that are going to happen that are just not flawless. But again, why are we doing it? And that's what we're talking about. Why are we idealizing? What is going on in our dysregulated nervous system? Where did that come from?
Yeah. And I'm glad you bring up these points, because it is not just with people, although it often is, but it can also be with things, and it can be with, it can also be with, religious figures, certain things that we've been raised to view in this kind of authoritarian lens, even if it's not authoritarian, even if it's not like, this figure is oppressive or has all the power, we still, our brains can look at, where can I be subconsciously, the child in this dynamic, and make them the parent. And we've talked about this before, where, if you come from these childhood trauma backgrounds, it's very common for your brain to be looking at, how can I kind of be in this, this non-threatening position? And when it comes to an authoritative person, how can I put them on that pedestal? So, because then it's a reenactment of the childhood trauma, right? I feel safe doing that, right? That's what the brain says, is oh, this feels safe, right? Because maybe this was the dynamic. If you had a narcissistic parent or parent with borderline personality or, any kind of personality disorders, it's very much a common tactic in being a child raised in that environment. And so then the child grows up, goes into the world, again, looks at things in very black and white, but is looking for that parent figure, right? And this could be a guru, it could be a TV show host, it could be any person that you can kind of feel inspired by, but it can kind of go from 0 to 100. And so I think that's one thing we want to get into is, really looking at like, how do we change that? How do we change the automatic trauma response of putting people in boxes, and whenever they've slighted you or done something hurtful, your brain as a trauma response might put them at a 0, right? And all of a sudden they have no value to you. And then with idealization, put them at 100. Maybe they did something, now they're at 100. This is not a healthy way of looking at things. It is a trauma response. So what we can get into next, just to kind of cover the basics, is what is devaluation. And devaluation is the flip side of idealization, right? So when the safe person doesn't meet the internalized fantasy or violates even like a subtle boundary, real or imagined, we talk about perceived abandonment and real abandonment, the trauma brain shifts to protect itself by tearing them down, right? All of a sudden, oh my God, this person is a threat, right? They're immediately at a 0. There's no middle ground. It's just they're a 0. They violated something, right? And of course, I'm not talking about, types of abuse. I'm talking about little tiny things that could set off that reaction in the brain, because it's a primitive form of emotional self-protection. It's the brain saying, if I destroy the connection, I won't be destroyed by it, right? And so we also have to remember that if you did grow up in a home where the parent was rapidly oscillating between these two states, right? Destroying the connection meant death. It meant dying, right? Because if there's a child reliant on that connection, what happens, right? They need this parent. They need this stable, authoritative figure to survive. And so if we think about like this dissociative all or nothing relational pattern, is driven by fear and not logic, right? That's why as it's happening, you've got an underactive or underregulated prefrontal cortex, which is where we have that logic and reason and rationale to say, okay, this is what's actually going on. And so the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, which are both involved in emotional pain and being rejected socially, they're activated during that time, during devaluation. And so what could be a mild disappointment feels like life or death betrayal to a dysregulated nervous system. So when we're kind of working through, okay, if you find yourself idealizing or devaluing, this is where you're going to kind of flip that and start to use some tools to look at, how do I not become so reactive? Or if my brain is going to take me there, right? And if I understand that my brain is not me, it's separate from myself. It's not my identity. We get stuck when we think our brain is our identity. It's not, right? It's a part of us. And so if we say, okay, I can consciously acknowledge my brain is taking me places where I don't want to go, and it's doing it to protect me from threats that are no longer there, then I can stop this process and start to minimize the reactions and the way I perceive the world around me, the way my brain perceives the world around me. And then I can kind of start to understand, okay, when am I idealizing? When am I devaluing someone? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I look at it in my own experience, because I've done this, and still to this day as a response of the nervous system doing that as a mechanism to to get by in the human experience at times, to be able to, the body, as we have learned, the body likes to keep the score. And so we have as much as the affirmations and the journaling and all the things that you try to do to override the nervous system, which I jokingly have called, and I think I said this on one of the episodes, the nervous system as being godlike, because it really, as much as you want to feel good and move forward and have connections, the nervous system is many times keeping you from really having the experiences that you really do desire, which is wholeness and connection and contentment and joy and peace. But the nervous system is not allowing that. And so, when you get into the daily experience of idealizing people and idealizing different types of, like I said, could be money, it could be psychedelics, could be crypto, but especially these ideas of, let's say, religious figures, spiritual figures, mentors, coaches. I can even count how many events I've been to as an entrepreneur, and it's like these are worshipped like gods. These people, Tony Robbins, Joe Dispenza, all these, and I understand they're super successful, but it's almost like a cult-like vibe sometimes because they're so idealized. It's like, wait, they're a human, like, right? They're living optimized experience. They're teaching methods, but you have everything that they teach you is going to be activated from you within to heal, to help yourself. So again, it's idealizing these different experiences. So then, like you said, the devaluation, it's like black and white thinking too, right? Like idealization is blocking intimacy. It's disconnecting from the actual truth. The truth is crypto is not going to go to a 500 trillion and win money overnight. Like that relationship with that significant other is going to say things that hurt your feelings. They are going to get sick. They are going to have these experiences where they're not perfect. And so it's showing us that, no one is above us. We're all learning, we're all healing, but the devaluation becomes extremely serious for someone who is prone to a dysregulated nervous system. The evaluation will come and it's black and white. Like you said, there's zero now. And it can bring on some really deep emotions, including depression, anxiety, but even anger and rage, where it's like, oh my God, my brother, he's a zero now because he didn't call me back, or he didn't acknowledge this, or didn't recognize. And so it becomes this really intense experience when devaluation happens after you've idolized someone for a period of time.
It does. And I think it's interesting you brought up, Tony Robbins and Joe Dispenza. And if you think about like someone with this trauma patterning and they, see somebody like Tony Robbins or Joe Dispenza and they say, oh my God, this person is so emotionally safe, right? That's a really easy way for the brain to go in and create this false sense of security and elevate them on the pedestal. Or another thing can happen where, you meet someone who's a narcissist or has these narcissistic wounds and it looks like confidence, right? And so the brain says, oh my God, this person is very secure, right? They know what they want. They have confidence. They radiate that confidence. I want to be like them. And so then we put them on a pedestal as well. And when we talk about devaluation, right, there's a lot there with narcissism. A lot of people that suffer narcissistic abusive relationships are on the receiving end of devaluation, right? Where all of a sudden, after all the love bombing, all the care, all the concern, all the emotional safety, then the person experiences being devalued by their narcissistic partner or their narcissistic loved one or family member or friend. And then all of a sudden it just switches, right? And so when the brain says, if I destroy this connection, I won't be destroyed by it, it's a very extreme way of thinking. And again, it really is just them trying to protect themselves. It's their brain trying to protect themselves. But yeah, there's a lot to break down in terms of these ideas, but I think the goal of today's episode is to empower people to first understand them and then recognize when they're doing them, if they are doing them, right? Because it could be very subtle. You can just kind of make a list of the people in your life and ask yourself, do I idealize these people, right? Do I idealize this person or that person? And why might I be doing that? And how can I kind of bring that down to maybe a more of a reality-based expression of appreciation for them, or looking at them as someone you admire, right? But then you don't have to put them on the pedestal, right? And just kind of keeping a more grounded, well-balanced nervous system perspective of the relationships in your life.
Yeah. And like you said, to start to look at how can we start to heal this? How can we start to move towards correcting this experience, right? We talk a lot about corrective experiences and how do we start to move forward towards that. And I think, one of the ways is to write down the ways and the people that you are idolizing, or things, maybe psychedelics, maybe religion, but whatever it is that you're idolizing so much that you're bypassing your feelings, that it's keeping you dysregulated when it goes the opposite way. Maybe you see something on the news, a tragedy, and now God is no longer idealized. It's like, oh my God, how can that happen? And now you're dysregulated because, it's not perfect. It's not flawless. It's not what your nervous system was projecting to keep you safe. So I'm curious when it comes to thinking about ways of moving towards healing this. And this is a lifelong journey, folks, right? Oh my God. I mean, to even receive what we're saying about idealization, devaluation, if you've been experiencing this your whole life since you were a child and you're hearing this for the first time, this could be like, whoa, I need to listen to that again. Like and that's what it was like for me when I learned about these concepts. And I could finally put words, which words can be very cheap sometimes. They don't do the justice. But when I could put the words of idealization, devaluation, that what was happening in my human experience, it brought extreme grief, but it also brought illumination. But there was a lot of grief to realize, like, I am doing this all of the time. I am idealizing all the time. Then I get in relationships with people, friendships, family members, romantic partners, and then I start this cycle of idealizing and devaluation. And that's a hard pill to swallow if you've been doing that for decades. So I would say, on my side, I would say self-compassion, have compassion and care for yourself. If you're hearing this and this is resonating or landing, and then, like you said, writing out some ways, writing out the people, writing down ways you're doing this. What are some other ways? And obviously, like, you're a therapist, I'm a therapist, psychotherapy is helpful, but what are some ways where we can start to work through this and work with it?
Yeah, so I think about a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Harpreet Malla, and she does a great job of going over these concepts. And the idea is that we're kind of looking at things from a dial perspective. We're saying that instead of the 0 or 100 reaction, which happens with 0 being the devaluation of others and 100 being the idealization of others, we're taking our brain out of that space and we're allowing for a gray area. We're taking our amygdala, out of that fight flight response, or our nervous system, but our amygdala out of that warning signal. And we're saying, let's have a corrective experience with this. And so how we do that is we start to assign numbers to individuals in our lives, right? This is not to be controlling. This is actually for our own regulation of our own nervous system. And so what we're saying is that, for example, let's say you have a friend and I don't know, your friend said something that hurt your feelings, right? Your brain, as a trauma response, is going to go and put them in a 0 if you have this chronic dysregulation. And so what you're doing to correct that is you're going to say, no, brain, you're not going to put it in a 0. I'm not in the past. I'm not in the environment that I grew up in. I'm not constantly having to trace or track my dysregulated parents' emotions. I'm here in the present moment. So I'm going to be able to correct that experience, and I'm going to say, you know what? My friend hurt my feelings, but I'm not putting them at a 0. I'm going to put them at 30, or I'm going to put them at 40, and I'm going to give some room there. And then maybe they say something else that's hurtful. And then maybe they lost some points. They lost 5 points, or they lost 10 points. But this is so much more realistic, right? Because it keeps your brain from really looking at someone that slights you as enemy number one. It takes you out of that space. It takes you out of this reactive space, and it puts you more in a reflective space. So we're looking at assigning numbers to individuals and holding them in that space. Now, this is what people do subconsciously when they're raised in environments where they don't have to be in that fight or flight. They don't have to track the dysregulated parent, where that parent is showing them, I'm either 0 or 100, and there's no in between. And for that child, it's very scary. And so we're taking you out of that space. We're telling your nervous system we're in a new space, and we're empowering you with the gray area. So when you try this out, you're assigning a number to people, and then when they slight you or bother you, you're keeping them in the space of compassion, essentially, right? This space is where compassion is. And we don't freely give it to everybody. It is earned, right? And I want to be clear about that. And at the same time, if you're somebody who suffers from this trauma response as a result of your childhood or other life experiences, you're going to need to start implementing this to train your brain that we don't have to be in this survival mode all the time, that we get to explore the world outside a black and white lens.
Yeah. And, we brought up crisis management addiction last episode, and this fits in really well too. You're managing these crises that are, a lot of that is related to idealization and devaluation too.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to, so that's a great episode. If you didn't listen to the last episode with Dr. Keean, we talked about crisis management addiction and how this can relate as well to this. And so I hope that idea of idealization, devaluation resonated with you. And again, this is stuff that's pretty common in the recovery space, in the spiritual workspace. I mean, this stuff is what's going on. And I think a lot of people are maybe not being able to put words to it. I didn't. I studied psychology for a very long time, and I never have heard of these ideas of devaluation, idealization. And like I said, when it hit hard. It hit hard when I realized that this was what was happening. And so, with that said, one of the things that you've mentioned before in our discussions is maybe this can, who knows where this will go, but you talked about living in a borderline society. And so how does that relate to this idea of idealization and devaluation, when that comment you made about this idea of a borderline society?
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of people that have been traumatized, and then their reaction to it is, their brain's reaction to it essentially is to try to find safety, right? And so we see this in, just systemic oppressive systems, right? The systems of people trying to survive and regulate themselves and having access to resources, basic human needs, food, water, shelter. And then we see it in, media. We see it we saw it with COVID, right? There was a lot of trauma with COVID. A lot of people were stuck at home. They couldn't go out and be unconscious and just go, be disconnected from the trauma or the pain that was stored in their body or nervous system, because they couldn't go out to anywhere because it was all closed, right? So they had to stay home, and there was a lack of community support. right? So they're kind of, when we see how people are reactive, there was this massive, space and time where there was so much to process in people's psyches and nowhere to go to kind of regulate, right? The gyms were closed. There were movie theaters closed. Social events were not, accessible. And so we see, like, when a society is driven by fear, which is our society, unfortunately, right, that the brain will learn to adapt and cope. And so what has happened and what we're seeing is that the amygdala is in this constant fight or flight mode. And the prefrontal cortex goes offline under stress. So that means that, a person can't think clearly or regulate their behavior. And the vagus nerve isn't co-regulating, right? Because there's no felt sense of safety in the body. And so this leads to that emotional impulsivity. It leads to the black and white thinking. It's this desperate attempt to kind of control or, merge with others, right? Find like that pack as a form of internal regulation. And so what we're kind of witnessing is that people are in a very reactive state, and their brain is putting things in boxes. This is safe, this is unsafe, kind of like what we talked about, right? But on a more systemic level, on a more collective level. And as an individual, we can see, okay, I am experiencing idealization with my coach, or idealization with this, I don't know, author that I look up to, or this person running self-help seminars. And I might be devaluing the person that hurt me, right, as a trauma response. And there's levels of severity with all this, right? So there are people that are much more unable to get out of that space, right? It's harder for them. And then there are people that have moments of idealization and moments of devaluation. But what we're seeing in the world is this massive collective idealization and devaluation of certain things, because the world is not safe. And the brain, everyone's brain that is going through this experience, feels that, right? And so they want to find their group of people that feels safe and regulating. And they may idealize that group of people, and they may devalue another group of people. But the whole idea is that, when they're looking at things, this is more of a reactive space, but it is understandable, right? It's like, why is it happening? Well, it's because this is not a safe environment that we're in right now, right? It's very unpredictable. It's been a very unpredictable space. And so being in an unsafe environment, the brain is going to adapt to that. And it's going to be a roller coaster between emotional flooding and emotional starvation, and the amygdala in the fight or flight mode, and the prefrontal cortex going offline, and all these things happening that lead to the emotional impulsivity and the black and white thinking. And so what we can do collectively is we can recognize, how are we doing this in society, right? Are we doing it with groups of friends? Are we doing it with sports teams? Where are we doing it? Because it is definitely a trauma response, but it's very complex, because it is the result of being in these oppressive spaces. It is the result of not feeling safe, right? You can't tell the brain to feel safe if it's getting more and more evidence that it's not safe. But what we can do is, on an individual level, we can bring it back to our nervous system and how do we regulate? And also, on a collective level, how do we co-regulate with people that are safe? So our brain can kind of, when it goes into that impulsive space, we can remind ourselves and give evidence to our brain and body and nervous system that we don't have to be in that space all the time, that we do have some agency in telling our brain, with this person, I feel safe, right? Or with this group of people, I do feel safe. And I'm also going to acknowledge that I feel, in terms of safety, from 0 to 100, I feel maybe 60 or 70. but I'm not going to idealize situations. I'm going to look at them with nuance, right? For clarity.
Yeah, what was coming up for me is like the idea of President Trump coming in and fixing the economy and fixing the markets. And as we saw during the inauguration, the markets boomed like in an incredible way. And a lot of people benefited from that. But then once he was in office, the markets collapsed and it was just carnage. If anyone experienced that this year, that was in the markets, whether that was the S&P or crypto. And then, of course, if you're idealizing this person, and this I'm just giving an example of our current president. This could be idealizing the government, idealizing policies, idealizing any of these people in power. And then, of course, look what happened. Like, boom, the markets came down. There was a lot of damage that happened to people when that happened. And what happened, right? People said, oh my God, he turned our back on us. And so it's just like it becomes this cycle. And I think that helps to bring it to removing even the trauma aspect of it, that we do this all the time. We, like you said, we do this with our sports teams. We do this with all these different entities. And it comes back to, I think, something we've introduced before about instead of being the supportive lead of your life, being the main character. If you're the supportive lead in your life, then you will respond to market swaying, to presidents making comments, to this group of people saying these certain things. And then you're completely off the rails. And it's from 0 to 100, it's a 0, black and white, right? There's no nuance of like, well, maybe there is some good in this. Maybe there's something I can see. And I think that that's also empowering as someone who's listening, who is an entrepreneur or wants to be an entrepreneur. And there's reasons for that. Not everyone's going to be an entrepreneur, but you can be an entrepreneur of your life. You can take charge of your life to be the main character of your life and not the supportive lead. And idealizing people and putting them on pedestals puts you in the supportive character. You're not being the main character. To remember, like, that person you're looking up to has flaws. They're not perfect. They're going to let you down. And then that's when you can come back to like, okay, what is this person from 0 to 100? They're actually a 60. They're not 100. And they never were 100 because no one has ever been 100. And so I think that's really important to remember this. And we are in extreme times. So I think this is extremely relevant conversation to have, to tie it all into how we operate and how we operate as a society.
Yeah, and I think, when it comes to kind of the reaction piece, another tool is when you feel emotionally flooded, this kind of trauma recovery practice is to intentionally scale down your reaction down to 50% of what your nervous system wants to do. And so we're kind of naming the impulse. And, if it goes back to like, let's say you were texting somebody and then they stop responding and you have this impulse and your brain goes into, again, that really 100% reaction. It's like, I want to text them 8 paragraphs right now, but then I can pause and say, what would this look like at 50%? Right. So, and maybe it's journaling instead of texting. And it's like, I have to get everything out, right? Like I had this amazing session and I want to write down everything and can't forget anything, right? Because it's life or death. I need this information. Well, what would this look like at 50% if I pause? What information was key to me? Can I get that information again? And that idea of not having the information goes back to that childhood trauma or early relational attachments of I need the information in order to feel safe. My brain needs to predict what's going to happen in the future with this dysregulated person. If it is the parent, is, mom or dad going to, or any parent or caregiver going to be at a 0? Are they going to discard me? Are they going to devalue me? Or am I going to get the 100? Right? And so our brain will automatically need to intentionally scale down the reaction to 50% because it was always at 100% and it was out of our control. But we do have the control now. And so when we do that, right, if we just take space, maybe wait 24 hours before making a decision, tell someone, right, like, I'll think about it before making a decision. If you feel the need to wait or pause, making them wait, it actually builds prefrontal override. So this is like the capacity to stay conscious when your trauma brain is trying to hijack the narrative or going into these spaces, because it reintroduces choice into our survival system. And it also lowers cortisol and adrenaline surges that create and, amplify the emotional distortion. And so that's that. It's not suppression, it's regulation, right? We're not suppressing. When we bring the reactivity down to 50%, we can better assess, like, is this about them or is it about me? Right? Am I reacting from now or from back then? Because the other piece is giving ample evidence to your nervous system and your brain that you are not in the environment that you were before. And that you can teach your brain and your nervous system that I'm in environment B now. I was in environment A, and when I was in environment A, I did not have choices, and my brain had to learn to be this reactive because there were no choices, right? And we see this with all types of trauma, and especially in, people of color that have had to navigate the world that was very unsafe, and microaggressions came up, and, little things were said to them that were then put into their psyche and made them feel unsafe because it was unsafe. And so a lot of us have this conditioning and we don't even realize it. It's completely unconscious, and it doesn't have to be extreme. It can also just be manageable. And there are different levels in which the idealization or devaluation could impact somebody, but it has to be, that we start to look at things and build that prefrontal override and pause and use the dial system to reintroduce choice into our nervous system and say, I have autonomy here. I can better assess when I pause, when I make the proactive decision to give myself time to respond, because the trauma response makes us respond very quickly, right? Because it's a survival instinct. So we're taking ourselves out of that and we're putting ourselves back into reflection.
Yeah, and I think yeah, for sure. And I think looking at this too, as I'm a big fan of Carl Jung's work. I can't get enough of it. And I in some ways, I wish my schooling was all about Carl Jung, but it wasn't. It was about CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy was a heavy focus. And I wish it was Jungian psychology, just because a lot of the stuff we're talking about too is really, it's unconscious. This stuff is unconsciously happening in the nervous system. It's something that's very deeply embedded into society. It's that collective unconscious too of these topics we're talking about it. But in a person, a lot of this stuff is in the unconscious. It's out of the awareness, and we don't know what's really going on with us. So we may be very successful. I know many entrepreneurs very successful who are still utilizing different medications and SSRIs and many things because they still have dysregulation. They still have depressive, episodes. They have anxiety. They have these things. But on the outside, I mean, you look at their Instagram, you look at their videos, you're like, wow, look at them. They're amazing. They're flawless. They're just crushing it. But they are battling with this internal dysregulated nervous system, which to me is also connected to this idea of the unconscious. And I know this quote gets overused, but, I love Carl Jung's quote because really my life's work has been he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And I look at that like, ooh, that one hits really deep, because how much of our lives are we just running from the unconscious and not consciously choosing to be the main character, choosing to take ownership of this idealization devaluation cycle that we may be in. And even if it's only partly true that that's true for you and resonates stuff in this episode, I think all of us at times have worshiped or really put people into these categories, especially maybe romantic partners where, oh my God, they're flawless. And, and I think that just to provide that human experience perspective of, hey, we probably all have experienced this, but just like addiction exists on a spectrum, this exists on a spectrum. There's extreme addiction. There's people shooting fentanyl every day of their life. And then there's people way over here who just are recreationally using. They're very successful. That's also an addiction, but it's managed. It's very different. It's just like the scale of what we're talking about when it comes to nervous system dysregulation. There's a spectrum there. There's a spectrum with idealization, devaluation.
Yes. And it makes me think about another thing that I wanted to mention earlier, which is, when we look at the other ways we can combat this is understanding emotional fusion. And emotional fusion happens when a person cannot differentiate or notice the difference between their emotional state and another person's emotional state. So their identity, their self-worth, and their emotional regulation of their nervous system can become enmeshed with the other person. And this again goes back to the early enmeshment with the caregivers, right? Where boundaries weren't respected and autonomy wasn't safe. And there wasn't that safety of having a different identity than the parent, right? Having a different sense of self than the parent. And so what our nervous system and our brain can do is it can adapt to feeling what others feel before identifying our own emotions and becoming hypervigilant to, a friend's or partner's mood shifts, right? This is where we see like emotional monitoring, where they'll say, "Are you okay? Are you feeling okay? I'm just checking in. Are you feeling okay?" Right? Because that emotional fusion will kick in and it confuses conflict with abandonment. And so from like a neurobiological perspective, there's mirror neurons and oxytocin dysregulation, which plays a huge role, especially if the nervous system was wired in upbringing or home where love was fused with responsibility or emotional caretaking, or if love was fused with violation and oppression or, hurt. See that in people that are, survivors of all types of abuse, where then love is not safe and can't be trusted, right? So they then develop this fear of being abandoned, but then also fear of being engulfed, right? So it's like that push-pull dynamic of, well, if you get too close, right, then you're just like the person who gave me love before, and I don't trust that, right? Even if maybe your intentions are very pure, the other person with that trauma might want to pull back, right? Or have like a escape hatch, right? So we're not going to get too close, right? Because if we get too close, then I have that fear of enmeshment, or that fear of, the fear of being overcome by the emotion and the fear of being engulfed.
Yeah. This idea of emotional fusing, another really powerful concept that can definitely relate to, again, having these experiences we've talked about where you're fusing to the person who maybe even abusing you emotionally. You're fusing to these people because there's some type of authority you're giving them, idealization, you're putting them in this place. And next thing you know, you're fusing and you're literally becoming dissociated with your own emotions. You dissociate and you just become enmeshed or engulfed by this person's emotions, trying to regulate them, trying to be the caretaker, when you really can't. But it's again, unconscious. It's a response you've had maybe from survival, from childhood. And these are,
yes.
Yeah. And these are ideas that, again, just like making the unconscious conscious, we're putting words to experiences to help to validate your experience. If you've had these experiences, now we're trying to validate them, just like Keean, when he solved this puzzle for himself, said, whoa, I now am finding peace and self-compassion because I'm putting words to what happened to my experience. And so am I. And that's the beauty in this, right? This actually happened to you and it happened to me. And now you're a doctor, you're using your knowledge to share your experiences, to share with others and how they can heal and work with this. I'm doing the same thing. I'm speaking from the receipts of this is how I've operated, and I still operate like this. I still idealize. I still experience idealization. And this is something that, oh my God, if we go to a scale to 1 to 100, it used to be 100. And today maybe it's a 20 or a 30. And sometimes it can be higher. If on a day I feel dysregulated, I wake up and, it's raining buckets all day, which actually I love the rain here now, but you're just in this certain space. You woke up and you just don't feel regulated. That could be a day where idealization is going to be way higher and devaluation is going to be way higher on that scale. And so it's just humanizing this experience in this body, in this human.
And if you are experiencing that, just thinking about like, am I fusing with the narcissist, or am I fusing with someone with, personality disorders, or someone who's chronically dysregulated to keep the peace, right? Am I able to express my own emotions in the moments that I have interactions with them, or do I have to fuse? Do I notice that my nervous system, and maybe now that it's more conscious because we're talking about it, maybe I notice that my nervous system and my brain is automatically taking their side, even if I disagree, even if I don't feel comfortable, because I don't want to, I want to avoid the conflict. So I think in the days that you wake up where you notice you're dysregulated, keep an eye out for that, right? Notice, am I fusing right now to this other person's emotions, or am I prioritizing understanding mine? Am I having a relationship with mine, or am I quickly agreeing and letting go of my autonomy?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, just to add a little to that is, my experience has been dependent on other people's reactions most of my life, waiting and scanning the environment and waiting for their reactions. Then I can proceed. And that's, that's what we're kind of talking about too. It's that scanning the environment and then waiting for someone to react. Okay, now we know what to do. Instead of approaching this as I'm the main character here. I am going to assign levels to how I feel today, and I'm going to assign levels to people that I meet and the trust factor I have with them, 0 to 100. And I know it sounds like it's pathologizing or putting psychology into everything, but for many, it's extremely helpful to do this. I find it extremely helpful to do this, and it's a practice. It's a practice just like meditation, or a practice like you do with these different ways. I mean, look at the explosion of self-regulation practices in the last 4 years, 5 years. Like, why is that happening? Because we have the post-COVID, the post-COVID depression coming. That is coming from from having those experiences of COVID. We're feeling the effects, and it's just creeping up of what's happening as a result of what happened through COVID. And now we're in a system now where we need to heal. And this is why we're having these conversations. And
yeah, absolutely. And I think, just allowing yourself to not make it too complicated, right? These are terms, they're psychology terms, but really it's just saying like, I have a brain and I'm going to start having a relationship with it. I'm going to start understanding what it does. I'm going to start looking at the different parts of the brain, right? I mean, we know the parts of our body. We know we have, hands and feet and arms and legs, and we know what they do. But if you ask, the average person, what does an amygdala do? They might know. What are mirror neurons? What is the prefrontal cortex responsible for, right? And it's just kind of it's giving that flashlight and saying, here, like, you don't have to be in the dark anymore. And there's no reason to be in the dark. I mean, this information is widely available, right? You have a relationship with your body, physical health. You understand the roles of the parts of your body. Start to try to look at, it's a simple thing, right? Understand the roles and parts of the brain. These ideas like anxiety and depression, they're very nebulous. We don't actually look at what's happening in the brain with these things. What changes are happening, right? If people started looking at the brain more and kind of understanding what role do the parts of the brain play, right? Then they wouldn't feel so in the dark. They would say, oh, my amygdala is doing XYZ. My prefrontal cortex is doing this or that, right? And my anterior cingulate cortex is just trying to, protect me. My insula is XYZ, right? And so we're having more dialogue with the parts of ourselves that matter. And it doesn't have to be this super scientific thing. It's, again, just naming the basics so we have some more awareness and we're not so helpless to the situation, because a lot of people, they don't have the information. They just have pop psychology terms. They know what anxiety is. They go to the doctor. They say, are you anxious? Yes. What does that mean? I mean, we don't really know what's happening in the brain. But when we start to break it down, we can understand. And then we can feel safer in our body.
Yeah. And in future episodes, we're going to get into that stuff in the brain. We're going to get into, like for me, getting into the heart stuff, the heart-brain coherence, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, these connections where, most people don't know that the heart talks to the mind more than the mind talks to the heart or the brain. So this idea of how the thalamus and the role of the heart communicating to the brain. And I would say that in the future episodes, I'll get into some of that research that is in the heart-brain, the heart-mind connection. And you will bring in deeper concepts of the brain, because the reality is when you want to go and address this stuff, when you look at these therapies that are emerging in psychedelics or ketamine-assisted therapy or even SSRIs, it's the brain. It's messing with the gut, of course, but it's also the brain. What's being activated, the serotonin, the serotonergic effects, the dopamine, the NMDA receptors with ketamine, the glutamate, all these things, which may sound like jargon, are extremely important when it comes to how these mechanisms of healing work. And in future episodes, we'll get into that as well, just to kind of break that stuff down, because it might be important to some of you to, again, understand what's happening in your experience and not leaving it to other people, not being the supportive lead, being the main character, being the self-scientist. Of course, do the research, talk to people who know what they're talking about, but also trust yourself ultimately and educate yourself to know.
Yeah. And don't trust, it's like you can become, your own expert. You can trust the experts, but don't idealize people. Don't idealize doctors and idealize, people in authority, because that can be a reenactment of childhood trauma. When we actually look at, okay, what does this person know that they can share with me that I don't know? What can I take with a grain of salt? What can I apply because it makes sense to me? When I'm in the driver's seat, right? I'm not so heavily reliant on these authority figures, right? Because the reality is that there's a lot of information widely available, and you can sit and give yourself space and time to think about what resonates with me the most, what would make sense with my situation, right? Because there's a lot of things that, are they appear to be a one size fits all, but they're not. They're not a one size fits all. And of course, we trust the research and we trust the experts, but we also just don't want to idealize, because that's where we're going into extreme thinking.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap it up here. I really appreciate this episode with you, Dr. Keean. It's really helpful for me. I know the audience members, they really appreciate you coming on talking about this. And I am excited because we are going to be putting together a little 4 to 6 week experience for listeners. And we're going to be working together to create some virtual classes online. And we're going to get into a lot of this stuff and maybe even create a little community afterwards. But for now, we're planning on putting together, where you're going to be talking deeply about the brain and how these things work. And I'm going to talk a lot about the heart and the things that I learned in my studies of the heart. And so I'm excited to do that with you. I'm excited. We'll be talking more about that in the next episodes. We have a few more episodes we're going to be bringing out, talking about this. But thank you so much for coming on the show once again. Appreciate you so much.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you very much as well. And I'm just excited to keep the dialogue going. And thanks for having me again.
Anytime. Thank you for checking out Entrepreneurs in Recovery podcast. We are so appreciative that you are here. Make sure you go ahead and like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Leave a review on iTunes and Spotify so more people can find the show. Once again, thank you so much. We have great episodes and content coming out in the future. Thank you for being here. Have a blessed day.